Gibson, the host of Keeping It Real, and I'm the publisher of NewSpiritJournal.com. At Keeping It Real, what we're all about is grounding spirituality, making it practical in our everyday lives. I have a delightful guest today. He has written a book called Carpe Diem, Seizing the Day in a Distracted World. His name is Roman Krznaric, and he is the founding faculty member of the School of Life in London and advises organizations, including Oxfam and the United Nations, about using empathy and conversation to create social change. His prior book was called Empathy, Why It Matters and How to Get It. But today I'm going to be talking to Roman about how we can seize the day. Hello, Roman. I'm so glad you could join us today.
Oh, I'm delighted to talk to you and have this conversation.
Yeah, well, Carpe Diem is something that is tossed around so much. And, seize the day, go for it. So tell us your perspective on this term and kind of how it's been hijacked, and let's talk about that a bit.
Well, it is an ancient concept. The idea of Carpe Diem, or seize the day, actually goes back to a poem written in 23 BC by the Roman poet Horace. And the last couple of lines of that poem really sum up what it's all about. He said, "Even as we speak, envious time flies past. Seize the day and leave as little as possible for tomorrow." And of course, that phrase, Carpe Diem, seize the day, it gets 25 million online search results now. It's incredibly popular. And partly that's because Horace, this poet, was raising one of the great existential questions. How should we live, given the reality of our mortality? The clock's ticking. So what decisions are you going to make? How are you going to live without regret? But in my new book, the real thesis of it is that, yes, we know what this idea is. We all have our own sense of it. But actually, the spirit of what Horace was originally trying to say has been hijacked. It's the existential crime of the century. There have been many forces which are, in a way, constraining or eroding what Carpe Diem really is or is all about. So just to give one example, think of consumer culture. I think that just do it has really become just buy it. We are so busy seizing the credit card that we're hardly seizing the day. Seizing the day now is all about Black Friday shopping sprees with their Carpe Diem messaging, buy while stocks last, seize the opportunity. It's been reduced to the instant hit of one-click online buying. And I doubt that Horace would have thought that Carpe Diem was really about getting a bargain down at the forum. He thought it was much more about making bigger decisions in life. And that's just one of the hijackers, consumer culture.
Well, one of the ones that you mentioned, too, that our audience particularly would be the mindfulness culture, because you even talk about how it's become just breathe it,
Yeah, the study of mindfulness is really interesting because I myself have done lots of mindfulness courses, both in the Buddhist tradition of mindfulness, meditation and breathing, but also the modern secular courses, which have become so popular in the mental health world, public health, education, business. And of course, there's so much evidence that they've had great benefit for people, from helping people deal with depression, anxiety, heart disease, stop smoking. So there's this wealth of evidence. But when I started doing my research on the relationship between Carpe Diem and mindfulness, I started coming across these critiques, which was very, very interesting. I mean, just as a precursor to that, one of the interesting things is that the meaning of Carpe Diem has changed in the last couple of decades. So if you ask people a century ago what Carpe Diem meant to them, they would never have said it was about living in the present moment or anything mindful like present moment awareness, being in the here and now. They would have thought it's all about grasping opportunities in life, or spontaneity, or hedonism, or other forms. But today, now 1 in 5 people associate Carpe Diem, or seize the day, with being in the here and now. And that, of course, is mainly due to the rise of the mindfulness movement. But the first critique I came across mindfulness very surprised me. It actually came from a very famous French Buddhist monk who I interviewed, a guy called Matthieu Ricard, who's a kind of right-hand man of the Dalai Lama. He's done TED Talks seen by millions. He's known as the happiest man in the world. And I said to him, what do you think of the modern secular forms of mindfulness, these courses that have become so popular, mindfulness-based stress reduction, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy? He said, well, the thing is, with a twinkle in his eye, he said, this thing is, you could have a mindful sniper or a mindful psychopath.
Yes.
To be a sniper, you need to be so focused in the moment, non-judgmental, just kill people and no judgment. Now, he was only half joking when he said that, because he knows that, of course, mindfulness courses have become very popular in the US military with real snipers, with Marines.
Yep.
Very popular amongst Wall Street bankers to stay cool and calm during high-stakes deal-making.
Right.
So his point, which I thought was really fascinating, was that the modern courses are in a way, have packaged mindfulness so much that we're getting mindfulness without morals. Mm-hmm. We're getting a mindfulness that might be good for us, right, but it doesn't necessarily make us good. And from a Buddhist monk's perspective, well, the Buddhist tradition of mindfulness integrates ideas of caring and empathy and altruism, compassion. And really, his argument is, so should the modern courses that people are doing, all over the place in community centers and elsewhere.
Right.
So I found that critique quite confronting, but ultimately quite convincing. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And the second critique of mindfulness I came across, which I thought was also pretty convincing when I really opened myself to it, was the idea that actually there are lots of different ways of entering the present moment. Mm-hmm. And everyone thinks, oh, mindfulness, this is the way to enter the present moment, which is true, but it's one way. Now, there are many other ways. Think of, for example, what psychologists call flow experience. Mm-hmm. That's where you're so engaged in an activity, something like a high-speed basketball game, where all sense of future and past disappear. You're just there in the zone and in the moment. Right. You're not doing anything particularly mindful. In fact, you might be doing something quite stressful or maybe highly creative, something very challenging where you're out of your comfort zone. But as Csikszentmihalyi, the psychologist who studied flow experience for nearly 50 years, says this is quite different from a state of kind of mindful attention. Mm-hmm. So flow experience is one example. Another one is the idea of exuberance. There's a very interesting psychologist called Kay Redfield Jameson, who studied schizophrenia a lot, in fact. She says, well, about 1 in 10 people are naturally exuberant. They have this capacity for being in the present moment. This is kind of zest for life. Mm-hmm. Something like Teddy Roosevelt was always chasing his kids around the White House and laughing uncontrollably. There was a British diplomat who once said, you must remember, the president is about 6. I thought that was lovely. So there's exuberance, there's flow, and of course there's collective ecstasy as well. When you're dancing in the crowd, you're listening to the pulse of the music, you almost lose your sense of individuality in a group consciousness, which brings you unconsciously into the present moment. Mm-hmm. So I think we should be cultivating all these different ways of being in the now, being in the here and now. I think they're all part of the human adventure, really.
And in your book primarily, now the first part of your book really talks about all of these concepts of seize the day and Carpe Diem, but then you talk about 5 ways that we need to revive. Can you kind of touch on those 5 ways? Because that's the bulk of the book, and it's kind of the bulk of your messaging, really.
That's right. I mean, I tend not to like writing books which are too negative and critiquing. Right. I found myself doing it a little bit in this book, unlike my last book on empathy. But what I discovered was that when you talk to a bunch of people and you ask them, what does Carpe Diem mean to you? They say very different things. Mm-hmm. And so I started doing some research with a team of researchers. We went into Oxford University's Bodleian Library. We looked through manuscripts going back 500 years, looking at how people have used the terms Carpe Diem and seize the day. And basically there was a pattern. There are 5 different ways humankind has discovered to seize the day. One of them is about seizing opportunities in life that might disappear and be lost forever, whether it's the chance to change career or rescue a crumbling relationship. A second way is through spontaneity, breaking out of the electronic calendar, being more experimental with the way we live rather than being hemmed in by all our time management techniques where we try and fit in dealing with more emails and so on. We hardly have time to be spontaneous anymore. A third form is the idea of hedonism and the seeking of pleasure, which was how people thought about Carpe Diem, particularly in the 17th century, but still quite common today. But hedonism has a very bad reputation. We associate it with drug overdoses and binge drinking. Right. But the Carpe Diem tradition has a much more, I think, virtuous and beautiful way of thinking of hedonism. It's more about having direct experience of the world, touching and tasting and feeling the world, rather than spending 7.5 hours a day on some kind of eye gadget, looking at a screen,
Yes.
secondhand experience. The average person still watches TV for 3 hours a day. That means by the time they're 75, they will have watched television for the equivalent of 9 years continuously.
Wow.
Which is pretty astonishing,
It
even though
is.
there's a lot of good stuff on TV, right?
Right, yeah. There's
So there's
balance.
seizing opportunities, there's the idea of spontaneity, there's hedonism, then there's presence, the idea of being in the here and now, whether you get to it through mindfulness or flow experience or collective ecstasy, other ways. Excuse me. And then there's a fifth way, which is political carpe diem. That's when people gather together en masse, collectively, and take those four forms of seizing the day, opportunity, hedonism, spontaneity, and presence, and take them from the individual to the collective level in order to bring about change. Mm-hmm. So think of, for example, the pink hats of the Women's March against Trump in January earlier this year. It's as if they had Horace whispering into their ears.
Yes.
Right? It was spontaneous mobilization, people really there in the present moment, taking an opportunity en masse, of course, and there was hedonism, there was partying, alongside very serious political intention, of course. But in a way, I think the pink hats, the Women's March, 500,000 people on the streets of Washington, D.C., 5 million around the world, they were in a way taking Horace's message to a new political level, from the singular carpe diem to the plural carpamus diem, which means let's seize the day together. Mm-hmm. And I think we're really at a stage in history where we need more of this Horace-inspired seizing the day together, to fight the rise of far-right extremism, whether it's in North America or Europe, to act on climate change. This is where the personal and the political start merging. Mm-hmm. And my books, I've always tried and find the overlap between these two things, between things which are important to us as individuals, but things which are also important to us collectively. And I think Carpe Diem is one of those.
And so somebody listening to this and feels like they want to absorb some of this in the sense of being able to help in the bigger picture, kind of like what you're mentioning with the Women's March or political or whatever, because so many people right now are so stressed, as you well know, about what's going on in the world politically and with climate change, all the things you mentioned. So how does someone listening to this or reading your book, how do they take these concepts and enact that on a daily basis? How do they carpe the diem?
Yeah, I think it's very important to start on a very personal level, a level that makes sense to you. Mm-hmm. I think a good starting point is actually to do what I call a death pause. Spend 5 minutes a day contemplating your mortality, thinking about that you're not here forever. So what are you going to do with your life, rather than spending your life watching reruns of TV game shows or other things, which have their place, of course, because we all need to unwind sometimes. But I think we shouldn't be afraid of thinking about death. Throughout history, human cultures have invented ways of thinking about death. For example, the idea of, this goes back to the ancient Romans, live every day as if it were your last. Mm-hmm. Okay, now for some people, find that idea very inspiring. Personally, I don't. I find it a little bit too short term. I like, for example, the Buddhist idea, live as if life is full of little deaths. To think that it's not only that we are just here, we have a beginning and an end, we die once, but in fact, every moment of our lives, life is very ephemeral. The flower blooms and then it dies. So smell the flower now. Your daughter is only growing up once, so spend time with her rather than with your inbox.
Right.
You're only in your 20s once. When you hit 30, your 20s die. So live your 20s now. Gotcha. And so these little things we can think about, every day and just bring them into our mind. I think that's one way to practice bringing Carpe Diem into everyday life. I think another thing is practice your spontaneity, even plan your spontaneity. In our hyper-scheduled world, I like to do my spontaneity between about 3 and 6 on a Sunday afternoon. I literally put it into my diary or my calendar, which sounds crazy, doesn't it?
It does.
How could we plan spontaneity?
Now.
Be spontaneous. I think as I get to that time, I don't plan anything. I hit 3 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon and I say to my kids, right, let's go and have a picnic up a tree or something like that. But I think there's a third thing, though, we can do, which is it boils down to 4 words, really, which is act first, think later. I think we live in a tradition of thought, which really goes back to the 18th century thinkers and the Enlightenment, where we do a lot of planning and reasoning and contemplating before action. So say you want to change career, find something more meaningful. A career counselor will normally say, okay, do lots of psychometric tests and research and planning, narrow down the options, then start sending out your applications, your resume, curriculum vitae. Now, that might get you a job. It's unlikely to be a fulfilling one, though, as the research shows, because you haven't actually tried out the job in reality. Right. You've got no idea what it's really like to be a lawyer or to be a manager in a cat hotel, whatever it is. And we need to have experiential learning through volunteering, shadowing, interning. We forge our identities in the white heat of experience. And this is something I've done in my own life. I had a job once which I wanted to leave. I was bored. I kept complaining to my partner that I wanted to get out of this and start teaching my own classes, in fact, on the art of living. And after about 3 months of complaining, my wife said, look, why don't you just send out an email and invite some friends to come and have a class in our own kitchen? And I said, look, I don't even know where to have the class. She said, just do it in the kitchen. And in fact, I did that 2 weeks later. 8 people sat around the table. I taught a course on how to rethink our attitudes to love and time. I was acting first and thinking afterwards because I really didn't know what I was doing. I was holding on to my existing job, and I kept running these classes, and then some started doing them in museums and public spaces until I felt the confidence to change. So I think if you feel like you're a procrastinator or apathetic or you've got no time, that act first, think later philosophy, I think, is a starting point. It doesn't work for everybody.
Right.
It doesn't work for everybody, but it's the opposite of how we tend to do things. It's you learn by doing, but we all intuitively know that, right? And how does a child learn to walk? Doesn't read a manual.
Exactly.
Just walk. Try, and you fall. Okay. But the falling is very important because this is about experiential living.
Right.
And the word experience comes from the Latin experimentia, an experiment. Experiments fail, right? But also within this Latin word experimentia is another little Latin word, periculum, which means danger. So there's always a danger involved in Carpe Diem living. And I think I had this very interesting conversation in the Netherlands a couple of days ago when I was launching the Dutch edition of my book. And someone said, well, look, wouldn't it be great if we just had virtual reality experiences for everything, really good quality ones that could start get all our emotions going, take us to the Grand Canyon, to Syrian refugee camps. We could be seizing the day at a push of a button. And my thought was, well, that'd be all fine, but there's no risk involved in having a VR headset on.
Right.
That's one of the differences between a manufactured experience and a real experience.
Right, exactly. Now, one thing you have in the book is at the back, you have a mandala. It's called the Carpe Diem Mandala. And one of the things you say about it, and it really encapsulates everything we're talking about, but I love how you said you'd like to see people tattoo this on their arm instead of the words Carpe Diem.
Yes, it's funny actually that today, the day we're talking, is actually, if you look on Twitter, it's World Goth Day. And there's in goths, traditionally, dressed in black, but they're the people who have a lot of Carpe Diem tattoos. But I think we need a more complex one that this mandala you mentioned has the 5 different kinds of seizing the day around the edge of it. And I think different forms of seizing the day work for different people. Not everyone wants to always be taking big risks in life. Right. A lot of people associate that with a kind of extrovert personality. Many other people would say, I want to, rather than seize the day, I want the day to seize me. I want to be in the moment of my day. And that's a type that really suits my personality best, or maybe me at this time of my life.
Right.
And I think things are always kind of shifting, aren't they? I think what's important is, and the purpose of that mandala really is not a blueprint for how you should make decisions in your life, but to make us stop and think about the choices that we make each day. Right. Almost to think, if you get to the end of your day and you think, okay, what were the big choices I made today, and what did they say about my values? If you did decide to stay at work for an extra hour to deal with your emails, rather than go home to play with your children, you're basically saying, I value my inbox more than my children, which might be appropriate sometimes.
It could be, right,
But,
exactly.
but you need to stop and think, okay, am I at peace with that idea? Can I look myself in the mirror and feel, okay, that's how I want to be living? Or, you know, and rather than us living on automatic pilot, I think we need to be very conscious of our choices. So many of our choices today are really like a choice between brands, iPhone or Samsung, Coke or Pepsi.
Right.
I think there's wiser ways to live than having the nature of choice. We feel we live in a great era of choice, but how much choice do we really have, or what are the really meaningful choices that we're making? And this is an old idea. This is what the existentialists were interested in, Jean-Paul Sartre and so on. How do we make authentic choices? Choices which are not just those of social convention or controlled by government or the market, but choices which are a little bit more authentic, is what the existentialists said.
Well, thank you so much. And I really encourage my viewers to get your book. It's a really good book, and there's so much. It's a really meaty book. There's in terms of ideas, but also in terms of practicality. And on this show, Keeping It Real, that's what we're all about, is practical, grounding things in our everyday lives. So thank you so much, Roman, for your time. I so appreciate it. And thank you for writing this book.
Well, it's been a pleasure and a privilege. Thank you.
Boy, I feel like I could listen to that interview again. He had so many wonderful things to say. And I really do enjoy the book, so I highly recommend it. It's not only a thoughtful book and gets you thinking about some different ways that our society has kind of morphed and changed, but it also has some wonderful ideas that you can actually encapsulate into your daily life and make your life more interesting, more fluid, and certainly more satisfying. Thank you so much for stopping by and watching Keeping It Real. And remember, as you go about your day, stay focused and keep it real.